February 1945. A cold wind moved across the wooden barracks of a women's POW compound in the American Midwest. The war in Europe was entering its final, violent months, but here the world felt strangely still. The German women held inside, former auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and factory workers, had grown used to the routine of captivity. Roll call, work details, the quiet hours of reflection that followed. That morning, a small group was led beyond the perimeter fence, escorted toward a nearby university facility used by the Red Cross for rehabilitative work assignments. None expected anything unusual, perhaps laundry, medical supply sorting, or clerical tasks. Instead, when the building doors opened, they froze. Inside was a large laboratory lit by winter sun. White-coated researchers gathered around instruments and drafting tables. Oscilloscopes, test benches, aeronautical charts, chemical glassware. And at the center of it all, young American women moving confidently between experiments, calculations, and machines the POWs had never seen before. For a moment, the German prisoners simply watched in silence, trying to understand what they were seeing and why it contradicted everything they had been taught. The shock of that moment begins a larger story that requires stepping back into the world that created it. To understand why a single laboratory site could shake a group of German women POWs, we must return to the world that shaped them, a world built on ideology, hierarchy, and a rigid vision of what women should and should not be. Long before these prisoners found themselves in American custody, their expectations about gender, science, and national destiny had already been defined by the system they lived in. In Nazi Germany, womanhood was not a social category. It was a state-directed function. From the early 1930s onward, the regime promoted a strict doctrine centered on kinder. Kush, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. It was a worldview repeated in speeches, propaganda films, school curricula, and youth organizations. Women were celebrated not as thinkers or innovators, but as mothers and supporters of the male warrior state. Their value lay in strengthening the nation biologically and morally, not intellectually. Universities reflected this design. During the late Weimar years, women had begun entering scientific fields in small but growing numbers: medicine, chemistry, mathematics, and even physics. Yet by 1934, enrollment quotas and cultural pressure reversed this progress. Female university attendance dropped sharply. Entire departments quietly discouraged female applicants, and leading National Socialist voices argued that scientific work strained women's natural purpose. By the outbreak of the war, German women represented only a thin fraction of engineering or advanced science students. While exceptions existed, some women became doctors, chemists, or lab assistants. They were anomalies, not the norm, and they rarely reached positions of authority. More often, women were guided toward nursing, clerical roles, domestic sciences, or service work within the NS-Frauenschaft and the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM. Young girls in the BDM learned cooking, childcare, physical fitness, and patriotic duty, but almost never mathematics or technical skill. Engineering, aeronautics, and laboratory research were seen as unsuitable for the female nature. The war modified this policy, but did not overturn it. As German men were drafted, women were increasingly mobilized into factories, communications posts, agriculture, and rationing offices. Yet even then, their roles remained carefully framed. They supported male experts rather than becoming technical experts themselves. Female auxiliaries in the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht-operated radios filled out reports or managed logistics, but few were trained to understand the deep scientific principles behind the machinery they handled. Inside Germany, scientific prestige remained overwhelmingly male. The regime celebrated engineers like Messerschmitt, scientists like Heisenberg, and rocket pioneers like Wernher von Braun. Their laboratories were centers of innovation, yet they were staffed by teams in which women were usually assistants, not peers. This ideological environment shaped the women who would later become POWs. Women who, up until the moment of capture, had likely never seen large numbers of females conducting high-level scientific work. Many would have understood laboratories and research centers only as places occupied by men, protected by institutions that guarded male dominance in intellectual fields. But ideology did more than limit opportunity. It molded perception. For years, propaganda had portrayed American society as chaotic, materialistic, and morally weak. German women were taught that the Allied nations suffered from social decay and lacked the discipline necessary for national strength. According to this worldview, Germany led Europe intellectually and culturally, while the United States relied on industry rather than intellect. The idea that American women, not men, but women, could match or surpass German scientific training would have been inconceivable within the Nazi frame of reference. By the time thousands of German women were captured in Western Europe in 1944 and 1945, clerks, communications personnel, Red Cross nurses, Luftwaffe auxiliaries, and civilian employees, they carried these beliefs with them. POW camps in the United States offered safety, food, relative autonomy, and even structured work programs. Yet even there, their worldview continued to operate in the background. Many still assumed Germany possessed cultural superiority, especially in education. The shock they would later experience in America did not emerge from a single moment. It accumulated gradually, during interrogations, through exposure to American newspapers and radio, through Red Cross educational materials, and especially through supervised work assignments outside camp boundaries. Every new piece of information challenged assumptions they had believed unquestionable. But nothing confronted those assumptions more directly than seeing American women in environments the Third Reich had effectively denied to them. University laboratories, engineering classrooms, aeronautical research centers, and wartime technical programs. Before we explore that contrast, we must first understand how the United States mobilized its women in ways Germany never imagined. Across the Atlantic, a very different wartime landscape was taking shape. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it faced an immediate and overwhelming demand for technical skill. Factories needed machinists and inspectors. Laboratories needed chemists, mathematicians, and researchers. Military programs required analysts, code breakers, and engineers. And universities were suddenly responsible for training thousands of specialists for a global conflict. Unlike Germany, the United States did not restrict this need to man. From the beginning, American leaders understood that the war would be won not only on the battlefield, but in the laboratory, the classroom, and the research center. As millions of young men left for the Pacific and European fronts, women stepped into roles the country could not afford to leave vacant. And they did not enter simply as substitutes. Many became innovators in their own right. By 1942, universities saw a surge in female enrollment in mathematics, physics, chemistry, and engineering courses. Wartime scholarship programs opened new doors. Technical colleges reorganized curricula to train women in drafting, aeronautics, metallurgy, and electrical design. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, predecessor of NASA, recruited women to perform complex aerodynamic calculations, stress analysis, and wind tunnel data reduction. These human computers, many of them recent graduates, were trusted with the mathematical foundations of aircraft design. At the same time, women filled the ranks of the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's cryptologic units. They broke codes, analyzed intercepted messages, and handled some of the most sensitive intelligence of the war. In research hospitals, female scientists conducted work in bacteriology, blood plasma preservation, and battlefield medicine development. In industrial labs, they tested alloys, refined synthetic rubber, and helped solve production challenges that kept American factories running at unprecedented scale. Their contribution was not symbolic. It was structural. By 1944, estimates suggest that more than 200,000 American women were employed in scientific, technical, or analytical wartime roles, alongside millions in industrial production. College classrooms that once held mostly men now echoed with the sounds of women debating formulas, drawing circuit diagrams, and presenting engineering solutions. Entire departments, once skeptical, adapted rapidly to this new academic reality. To American civilians, these changes reflected necessity combined with opportunity. To German POW women, they would later appear revolutionary. The contrast became strikingly clear in the environments where POWs were assigned work. Many camps employed women in agricultural or clerical duties, but a portion were transferred to local hospitals, war production facilities, or Red Cross affiliated programs. These facilities often had women in leadership or technical positions. A POW nurse working in a U.S. hospital might suddenly find herself taking instructions from a female American surgeon or lab technician, something nearly unheard of in German institutions of the era. The psychological impact was profound. Reports from camp observers, chaplains, and visiting Red Cross personnel note that German POW women were often surprised, sometimes quietly disturbed, by the authority and competence shown by American women in technical fields. Some reacted with skepticism or disbelief. Others expressed admiration they were hesitant to voice. A few would later describe the sight as their first realization that Nazi ideology had hidden a larger world from them. American media accessible in the camps further amplified this impression. Newspapers and magazines described women working on aeronautical research, supervising industrial departments, and joining the Women's Army Corps as mechanics and communication specialists. Photographs of female engineers standing beside aircraft components or working with drafting tools circulated widely. For many German POWs, these images were their first exposure to a society in which opportunity was not restricted by doctrine. Yet it wasn't simply that American women were present in the sciences. It was that they were encouraged, trained, and respected for it. And when the POWs witnessed these women perform complex tasks with confidence, it directly contradicted years of propaganda that claimed women were intellectually unsuited for such work. What they saw was not propaganda. It was lived reality, a reality that Germany, by choice, had sidelined. This growing realization that their nation had limited half its population while the United States empowered it marked the beginning of a deeper internal shift among many POW women. And it set the stage for the moment when admiration, confusion, and ideological shock collided. That moment becomes clearer as we examine the story from multiple angles. For many German women POWs, the greatest shock was not the presence of American women in laboratories. It was the silent collapse of a worldview they had been raised to accept without question. Nazi policy had defined gender not as a spectrum of potential, but as a rigid duty to the state. Women were told their purpose was biological and domestic, that scientific inquiry drained their strength, that intellectual ambition threatened the stability of the nation. This ideology was reinforced by schooling, youth organizations, and cultural messaging that portrayed female scientists as unusual or even unfit. In the United States, the reality was the opposite. When POW women walked into American research spaces, they encountered a world built on different assumptions, one that accepted women as capable of technical thought, disciplined study, and scientific leadership. That contrast struck with blunt force. The American system had not merely allowed women to participate, it had invited them to contribute. This ideological collision was not simply political, it was personal. For the POWs, the quiet hum of a university laboratory became a symbolic battlefield. Every slide rule, every drafting table, Every female researcher solving a technical problem challenged the internal architecture of beliefs shaped by years of indoctrination. The realization that those beliefs might have been flawed produced a discomfort deeper than captivity itself. And in that discomfort, the prisoners began reassessing the foundations of the world they once believed stable. The conflict between doctrine and lived truth formed one of the most transformative angles of their experience, setting the emotional stage for what came next. The German women's shock was also rooted in the stark differences between the educational systems of the Third Reich and the United States. Pre-war Germany had been a global center of scientific thought, but by the late 1930s, ideology had reshaped its academic landscape. Restrictions on women's enrollment, engineered by a state determined to reinforce traditional gender roles, produced generations with limited exposure to advanced mathematics and science. Many POWs had attended schools where chemistry was simplified, physics was underemphasized, and engineering was portrayed as inherently masculine. In the United States, wartime necessity accelerated female education. Universities opened accelerated programs to train women for technical and analytical roles. Chemistry labs expanded their intake, mathematics departments doubled their class sizes, and engineering faculties launched short-term intensive courses designed specifically to replace male labor. A woman entering an American classroom in 1943 could expect rigorous instruction, competitive standards, and a path to real responsibility. When German POW women observed these environments, the difference was startling not because the Americans possessed technology they lacked, but because women were central to its operation. For the first time, they saw a generation of females learning calculus, aerodynamics, and electrical theory, subjects German ideology had implicitly reserved for men. This angle highlighted something the prisoners had never considered. Their limitations were not natural. They were engineered. And seeing what women could study elsewhere raised difficult questions about what their own society had chosen to deny them. Beyond the technical skills they witnessed, what struck many POW women most powerfully was the confidence exhibited by American women working in science. They moved through laboratories with independence and authority, fully aware of their contributions to the war effort. For German prisoners accustomed to hierarchies that placed female voices behind male decisions, this display of self-assurance was compelling. American women introduced themselves as technicians, analysts, researchers, or students, titles rarely used by German women outside exceptional cases. They spoke openly about their academic goals, their aspirations, and the satisfaction of contributing to national research programs. Their professional identity was not an exception to the rule. It was part of a growing societal norm. In camp interviews and Red Cross reports, POW women often described their surprise at how naturally American females discuss scientific subjects. The conversations POWs overheard were filled with technical vocabulary, reaction rates, pressure coefficients, fatigue limits, blood plasma protocols. These were terms German women had rarely been encouraged to understand, let alone master. That confidence shook many POWs more deeply than the equipment itself. The presence of female competence, articulated with ease, suggested a kind of personal freedom they had not experienced. For women raised under a regime that praised obedience over intellectual ambition, this was a disorienting revelation. It was not only what American women were doing, it was how they carried themselves while doing it. Another dimension of the POWs experience was the quiet realization of what their own society had sacrificed. As they witnessed American women contributing to wartime research, many began reflecting on their own abilities and what they might have achieved under different circumstances. Some POWs had been talented students in subjects like mathematics or natural science, but were redirected toward domestic or clerical roles. Others have been told repeatedly that advanced study was unrealistic or inappropriate. A few had even dreamed of pursuing medicine or engineering before ideological barriers intervened. Seeing American women excel in precisely those fields exposed the scale of the opportunity that had been withheld. This realization carried a subtle but painful weight. For the first time, they could see the alternative paths their lives might have taken. The war had already cost them stability, safety, and national certainty. Now, it revealed the cost of suppressed potential. A scientific career was not impossible for them because they lacked intellect or ambition. It had been made impossible by design. That reflection opened an internal dialogue that many POW women would later describe as transformative. They began reevaluating not only their own experiences, but the broader choices of the regime that had shaped their lives. These angles formed the emotional and intellectual groundwork for the decisive moment ahead, the moment when observation became revelation. One of the most striking contrasts for German women POWs was the sheer fluidity of American wartime roles compared to the inflexible structure of the Third Reich. In Germany, even during total war, gender remained a fixed boundary. Policies shifted only when manpower shortages forced women into auxiliary positions. And even then, the state insisted their contributions were temporary, supportive, and subordinate. In the United States, mobility was built directly into the wartime system. When shortages developed in laboratories, universities, hospitals, or industrial test facilities, women were not simply allowed to step in. They were actively recruited, trained, and placed in positions that matched the evolving needs of the war effort. Female technicians moved between departments. Female analysts joined new research programs, and students transferred into accelerated courses designed to meet urgent technical demands. This flexibility amazed many POW women. They had never seen a system where a person's abilities shaped their opportunities rather than ideological restrictions. In the U.S., a woman with strong mathematics skills could enter aeronautics. A woman with steady hands and careful observation could train as a laboratory technician. A woman with curiosity could study chemistry or physiology. This fluidity revealed something extraordinary to the POWs. American society had built a wartime structure that expanded with talent. Germany had built one that shrank around it. The more they observed this contrast, the clearer it became that mobility itself was a military asset, one they had never been permitted to experience. The German POW women were not only witnessing American women working in scientific environments, they were seeing a broad spectrum of women represented in these moments. This mattered deeply. In Germany, female role models in science were rare and often invisible. Even a few pre-war trailblazers had been pushed out of academic visibility. Young women grew up seeing almost no examples of female engineers, surgeons, researchers, or inventors. In the United States, representation was woven into the fabric of wartime society. Newspapers featured images of female engineers calibrating instruments. University brochures showed women conducting lab experiments. Posters encouraged women to join scientific training programs. Even Hollywood newsreels depicted women making calculations, assembling precision equipment, or contributing to medical research. When POW women encountered these images in newspapers, posters, or real environments during supervised work, the impact was immediate. Representation challenged the assumptions embedded in their upbringing. If women could be scientists in America, why had they been excluded in Germany? If female intellect was valued there, what justified its suppression at home? Representation did not simply inspire curiosity. It produced cognitive dissonance. It forced the POWs to re-examine the beliefs they had been taught to accept, and it illuminated the possibility that gendered limitations were not natural laws but political choices. This angle widened the emotional gap between what they had been told and what they now saw unfolding before them. In the minds of many German POW women, science had always been associated with national prestige. The Third Reich celebrated its male scientists as symbols of technological superiority. German propaganda frequently emphasized scientific accomplishment as proof of cultural and racial hierarchy. As a result, many POW women viewed scientific progress as a direct reflection of a nation's power. When they observed American women studying advanced subjects, conducting research, and contributing to technical development, the symbolism was unmistakable. The United States had integrated its entire population into the pursuit of scientific strength. This was a dramatic contrast. In Germany, half the population was discouraged or outright prevented from scientific participation. In the United States, half the population was now reinforcing the country's technological infrastructure. The implications were hard to ignore. To POW women who still believed in German superiority, the realization was destabilizing. American laboratories were not merely functioning. They were thriving with energy, collaboration, and intellectual diversity. The American war machine was not powerful despite its women. It was powerful partly because of them. This understanding forced the POWs to rethink the nature of national strength. If science was a battlefield, then the United States had mobilized far more soldiers on it than Germany had allowed. The sight of women in scientific spaces became a mirror reflecting the weaknesses in Germany's ideological system, weaknesses that were contributing directly to its losses. Finally, the most human angle came from direct conversations, brief, supervised, but deeply revealing. Many POW women interacted with American female students or technicians during work assignments, hospital duties, or Red Cross-mediated programs. These interactions often began cautiously, shaped by mistrust and cultural distance. Yet even simple exchanges carried weight. A POW assigned to a hospital laboratory might speak with an American technician about routine procedures. Another might hear students discussing exam schedules or research projects. Some POWs worked near university campuses, where they occasionally saw women carrying textbooks, discussing assignments, or preparing for practical exams. These were ordinary moments, but to the prisoners, they were extraordinary. What struck them most was the normality of it. American women spoke about science as casually as German women spoke about domestic work. Their education was not framed as rebellion. It was simply part of life. They expressed ambition without embarrassment. They discussed goals without hesitation. These encounters broke ideological barriers in ways that no newspaper or observation could. They humanized the reality that women could excel in science, and that such ambition did not disrupt society. It strengthened it. For many POW women, these moments marked the beginning of an emotional shift that would culminate in a single, defining experience, the moment that forms the centerpiece of this documentary. The shock that came next was not only intellectual. It was personal. The convoy rolled to a stop beside a long red brick building that did not look like anything the German women had seen in America so far. It wasn't a farm. It wasn't a factory. It didn't resemble a barracks or a depot. A white stone plaque beside the entrance read only one word: science. A pair of military escorts signaled the women forward. At first, they hesitated, unsure why they had been brought here at all. The air carried a faint chemical sharpness. Chalk dust, heated glass, something metallic. The German women glanced at one another, their expressions tense, unsure. And then the door opened. What they saw beyond it stopped them in their tracks. Inside, rows of young American women, barely older than many of the POWs, stood around tall tables covered in beakers, tubing, voltmeters, and heavy textbooks. Overhead, the hum of fluorescent lights washed the room in a stark glow. A chalkboard stretched across the front wall, filled edge to edge with equations, energy states, atomic diagrams, reaction pathways. The German prisoners did not speak. They didn't blink. Some of them forgot to breathe. One of the American students, her hair pinned back under a lab cap, glanced toward the doorway with mild curiosity. She held a glass pipette with the steady precision of someone trained, confident, accustomed to being there. Her lab apron was speckled with iodine. Behind her, another student adjusted the settings on a small electrical device, consulting a thick engineering manual. To the German women, the sight was almost unthinkable. For years, Nazi ideology had drilled one message into them: science belonged to men. Women belonged to the home. Here, that doctrine collapsed in a single hallway. One POW, an older woman, formerly a schoolteacher, leaned forward instinctively, as if trying to verify the scene was real. Her lips parted in a small, soundless gasp as she read the equations on the board. She recognized some of them: advanced calculus, theoretical chemistry, material she had once been forbidden even to reference in her classroom. Another POW unconsciously gripped the sleeve of the woman beside her. Her voice trembled. "Frauen, women?" She could not finish the sentence. The guards did not interrupt. They let the moment hang. An American lab instructor, herself a woman, began demonstrating a reaction using heat in a sealed glass tube. The POWs flinched slightly as the burner hissed to life. But the students did not step back. They leaned in, observing with the trained focus of scientists in the making. That was the moment the German POWs understood the scale of what they were witnessing. These young women were not assistants. They were not observers. They were scientists in training. The POWs were guided deeper into the corridor. Another door opened, leading into a physics lab where women operated oscilloscopes and calibrated instruments for electrical measurement. A faint rhythmic tapping echoed from a metallurgical workshop nearby, where female students tested stress points on riveted metal plates, skills directly connected to wartime aircraft production. The realization struck like a physical blow. American women did not wait for permission. They were building, measuring, studying, producing, and the country trusted them to do it. As the POWs moved outside again, the cold sunlight felt different. They could still hear the buzz of equipment from inside the building. The sound followed them like an echo, as if the door behind them had opened into a world they had never imagined. But the Americans were not done. From the university, the POWs were taken to an industrial training facility nearby. Here, hundreds of women filled the floor, operating lathes, welding components, assembling delicate electronics for military radios and aircraft instrumentation. Sparks drifted. Machines hammered steadily. Women in protective goggles moved with discipline and confidence. The German prisoners stood in silence. Some swallowed hard. Some lowered their eyes. Some stared as if they were looking at the future, one they had been told could never exist. One prisoner whispered, almost to herself, "When Frauen das können, was Bleit übrig von dem, was wir Gellern haben." If women can do this, what remains of everything we were taught? No one answered, because the answer was unfolding around them in steel, in glass, in equations written by steady hands on chalkboards. The United States had embraced women's potential not as an exception, but as a strategy. And this single day had made the ideological distance between the two nations painfully visible. The POW convoy finally turned back toward the camp. But the moment they had witnessed would not leave them. And in the days ahead, the consequences of that realization would ripple through the compound. Quietly at first, then unmistakably. The world they thought they understood had been shattered. And the aftermath of that moment was only beginning. The trucks rolled through the camp gates just as the sun dipped behind the low winter tree line. The sky glowed in pale streaks of gold, but the German women barely noticed. Their minds were still inside the laboratories and workshops they had just seen, rooms filled not with soldiers, but with women shaping the machinery and mathematics of modern war. As they stepped down from the convoy, the atmosphere inside the POW compound had changed. A quiet murmur spread among the prisoners who had gone on the tour. Others gathered around them, curious. What had they seen? Why were they silent? But the women who had witnessed the American classrooms struggled to put the experience into words. One of them, a former nurse, found herself staring at her hands. Hands she had been told were meant for domestic care, and nothing more. Yet she had just watched American women using their hands to shape engines, calibrate instruments, and manipulate chemical reactions with expert precision. Another prisoner, once a clerk in a German municipal office, sat down on her bunk without removing her coat. Her eyes unfocused. She had spent years filing reports that warned against female education beyond the acceptable sphere. Now she had walked through a building where women were mastering physics formulas she had never even been allowed to read. The camp guards, noticing the shift in atmosphere, made no comment. They understood something the German soldiers never had. Ideas can do more damage to ideology than weapons ever will. Hours passed before the first conversations began. Softly at first, whispers in German slipping across baroque walls. Did you see them working with the voltmeters? They were doing mathematics, real mathematics. They looked normal, not strange, not unfit, intelligent, confident. They were our age, some younger. The whispers grew. Is everything we were told wrong? The question hung heavy in the air. By the third night, the camp commandant received quiet reports from the psychological operations section. The reaction was exactly what planners had predicted. The United States had not staged any part of the visit. They didn't need to. Reality itself was the propaganda. Let the prisoners see the truth, and the truth will do the talking. In the following days, the effects became visible. During work details, the women no longer moved with the same rigid posture prescribed by Nazi ideals. Their eyes tracked the machinery differently. They asked more questions about tools, about schedules, about how American logistics functioned. They watched the guards working with radios and power generators with a new kind of attention, as if the machines were no longer foreign or forbidden. Some of the POWs began to write quietly in notebooks, recording what they had seen. Not to betray Germany, at least not consciously, but simply because their worldview had been disrupted at the foundation. They needed to process it. Others grew withdrawn, grappling with guilt. All their lives, they had been taught that intellectual ambition for women was unnatural, selfish, destructive. But what they had seen in the laboratories was not destruction. It was competence. It was professionalism. It was the calm precision of women contributing to a national war effort with measurable, visible skill. The most dramatic shift came from the older prisoner who had been a schoolteacher. She had spent her career teaching only the subjects and lines approved by Nazi policy. Science lessons were heavily restricted. Advanced topics were off limits. She would often hide her own interest, afraid of suspicion. But after the university visit, something inside her cracked open. The following week, when a group of younger POWs asked her what an equation meant on a crate label, something mundane relating to measurement, she explained it. Clearly, confidently. She spoke softly, but with a quiet determination that had not existed before. It was the first time many of the women had ever heard scientific concepts explained by one of their own. The guards noticed. They said nothing. Meanwhile, military intelligence officers compiled their reports. The reaction of the German POWs mirrored similar results from Italian and Japanese prisoner studies. When exposed to American women working in scientific or industrial roles, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. The contrast to their home propaganda was undeniable. American society was not perfect, not in treatment, not in opportunity, but even the partial freedom given to women here was enough to fracture the ideological certainty of the POWs. And that fracture widened further during a routine Sunday inspection. A small group of German prisoners, walking near the administrative building, overheard two American women talking nearby. One a secretary, the other an engineering trainee. Their conversation drifted through the cold air. If I pass my exam next month, they'll place me in the aviation program. The German women stopped walking. Aviation program. Women. studying aircraft systems. This time, the reaction was not shock. It was something else, something more dangerous to the ideology they had once believed. It was a realization. American women were not simply supporting the war. They were helping shape its future. The prisoners exchanged looks. Long, quiet looks. There was no hysteria, no whispered panic, only understanding. They had lived inside a system that told them women were incapable of this. They had now seen that claim disproven with their own eyes. And that realization created the decisive moment. Inside the barracks that night, one of the younger POWs, barely 19 years old, finally spoke aloud what the others had been thinking. If German women had been allowed to learn like this, maybe the war would not look like it does now. Silence followed, but nobody argued. That sentence, spoken softly in the dark, marked the turning point. It was the moment the myth cracked open and a new clarity seeped through. The climax of their ideological shock had arrived. And what came next, the aftermath, would reveal just how deep the shift truly ran. The days that followed were quieter than anyone expected. Not the tense quiet of fear or punishment, but the reflective silence of people trying to reconcile a world they had seen with a world they had been taught to believe in. Inside the German women's barracks, conversations no longer revolved around war rumors, food shortages, or memories of home. Instead, they circled back again and again to one question. What if everything could have been different? The American camp officers, trained to observe psychological shifts, noted it immediately. These women were not simply impressed, they were unsettled, disturbed in a way that no leaflet, no loudspeaker broadcast, and no interrogation could ever achieve. What they had seen in the laboratories had reached deeper than politics. It touched identity. For German women raised under Nazi doctrine, their roles had always been defined with precision. Caretaker, mother, supporter. Their usefulness to the nation was biological and domestic. Anything beyond that was discouraged, and scientific education for women was outright obstructed. Now, for the first time, they had seen another society, an enemy society, investing in women not as symbols, but as contributors. It destabilized everything. One prisoner who had once worked in a rural German household confessed to a fellow POW that she had never seen chemistry equipment in her life until that day. I thought it belonged to men with spectacles. Professors, not women, never women. Her voice trembled with a sorrow she struggled to name. Another woman stayed awake at night, replaying the moment an American student had lit the Bunsen burner and adjusted the flame without hesitation. She had expected fear or nervousness, traits she had been taught were natural to women. But there was none. The student had moved with the confidence of someone who understood her environment, someone who belonged there. That image followed her like a ghost. Camp psychologists soon noticed the effects spreading beyond personal reflection. The German women began forming small discussion groups, something they had rarely done before without ideological anchors. These informal circles centered not on loyalty to Germany, nor on complaints about the camp, but on education. Education, a word their own government had treated with suspicion when applied to women. In one group, a former shop assistant described how she once dreamed of becoming a pharmacist, but was discouraged by local officials who insisted such ambitions were inappropriate. After seeing American women studying chemistry, the old dream resurfaced, and now it burned. In another corner, two prisoners debated whether German society could ever accept women in technical fields. Both concluded, slowly, reluctantly, that despite their upbringing, the war had already proven women's capability. They had filled munitions factories, staffed field hospitals, run farms, and even operated anti-aircraft batteries when men were scarce. So why? One asked. Did they tell us we could not learn science? The answers did not come easily. But the questions themselves represented a shift intelligence officers had hoped for, cracks forming in the ideological certainty of the prisoner's worldview. Even practical routines in the camp began to change subtly. The women took more interest in equipment maintenance. They asked about tools. They studied the American-made radios that played distant broadcasts. Some even requested access to English-language instruction books available in the camp library, books they had previously ignored. None of these changes were forced. They emerged naturally from curiosity that had been dormant for years. Meanwhile, American officials compiled their findings into internal reports. These documents, classified at the time, highlighted the same conclusion again and again. Exposure to women's scientific and industrial participation produced more ideological destabilization among German female POWs than any direct propaganda effort. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't admiration. It was the shock of seeing a forbidden reality. And the ripple effect did not stop at questioning the Nazi view of women. Some prisoners began reconsidering other aspects of the ideology they had once accepted without doubt. If the regime had lied about female capability, something now clearly disproven, what else had it exaggerated? What else had it distorted? This quiet process of reevaluation had strategic value. But more importantly, it had human value. For many of the German women, it was the first step toward reclaiming identities that had been limited and constrained before the war ever began. Yet the full consequences of this psychological shift, the deeper, longer-term aftermath, were still unfolding. And those consequences would become even more visible in the weeks that followed, as the POWs began to compare notes, challenge old beliefs, and confront the uncomfortable truth of the war they had served. By early spring, the ideological shift inside the camp had become measurable. It appeared in places the American officers did not expect. In the tone of letters the German women wrote home, in the questions they asked during medical inspections, in the way they observed American life unfolding beyond the wire. One guard later described it simply. They looked at the world differently, not like prisoners, more like students. The American Red Cross noted similar behavior. During scheduled cultural sessions, intended for morale, German POW women suddenly gravitated toward pamphlets on nursing, biology, and mechanical basics. They asked about vocational programs. They questioned the guards about opportunities women had in the United States before the war, not only during it. The shift was not uniform. Some women resisted the change, clinging to pre-war beliefs that had shaped their identity for years. But even those who resisted felt the pressure of the new reality. Their arguments grew strained, their certainty weakened. One internal report recorded a conversation between two POWs. But these American women, do you think they're exceptional? No, I think we were kept from becoming like them. It was the conclusion U.S. analysts had anticipated. The propaganda of superiority had cracked. Across the camp, subtle but significant behavioral changes emerged. Work details became more focused. Some women asked to be assigned to tasks involving tools or machinery. Others began keeping notes from discussions or observations, writing them carefully into small journals. The commandant, reading through the weekly psychological summaries, realized something profound. The shock of seeing American women in scientific fields had not demoralized the German POWs. It had awakened them. Yet the most meaningful consequences waited until the war's end approached, when Germany began collapsing under Allied pressure and rumors of surrender drifted through radio broadcasts. In April 1945, the women gathered anxiously around the camp loudspeakers, listening to news bulletins detailing the fall of German cities. The ideological uncertainty they had been wrestling with for weeks now collided with the brutal reality of defeat. One POW, once a proud supporter of the regime, was overheard whispering, "If they had let our girls learn, maybe we wouldn't be here." It was not spoken in bitterness. It was resignation, understanding. The combination of battlefield loss and ideological disillusion was powerful. Together, they reshaped the prisoners' view of the future. As the war officially ended in May, the camp shifted from wartime posture to preparation for repatriation. That transition revealed the deepest layer of the aftermath. Many of the German women no longer feared returning to a Germany without the Nazi regime. Some even expressed cautious hope. Others quietly vowed to pursue education when they returned home, if their cities still had schools. During interviews with Allied officers, several POWs voiced the same sentiment. We want to learn. We want our daughters to learn. This was unprecedented. In the early years of the war, few German women in similar interviews had spoken of education or careers. Now, it became the most common topic. The American officers filed these reports, unaware that they were documenting the earliest seeds of a cultural shift that would unfold over decades in post-war Germany. When women began entering universities, scientific fields, and professional roles that had once been closed to them. Inside the camp, farewells grew emotional. Some guards had watched the transformations unfold slowly, day by day. The women who boarded the repatriation trucks were not the same group that had arrived months earlier. Their worldview had expanded. Their ambitions had changed. Their understanding of capability, especially female capability, had broken free from ideology. One guard, watching them depart, wrote in his log, "They came here believing the enemy was ahead in weapons. They leave knowing the enemy was ahead in ideas." As the last convoy pulled away, dust swirling behind the wheels, a final realization settled over the camp personnel. The war had defeated Germany's armies. But education, simple, visible, undeniable education, had defeated one of its deepest myths. And it was that realization, carried in the minds of the returning POW women, that would continue shaping their lives long after the barbed wire was behind them. The aftermath had set the stage for a wider truth, one that the final reflection would make clear. Long after the trucks left the camp, long after the uniforms were exchanged for civilian clothes, long after the war's fire finally cooled, the memory of that single day, the day they saw American women studying science, remained with the former prisoners. It stayed with them not as a humiliation and not as admiration for the enemy, but as a moment when the world quietly revealed a truth larger than ideology, larger than nations, larger than war. A truth about potential. For so many of these women, the war had been a narrowing of life. Their choices reduced. Their roles defined long before they were old enough to question them. Their ambitions shaped by a state that saw their value only in motherhood, obedience, and sacrifice. The United States had its own prejudices, its own blind spots, its own struggles. But in laboratories, in classrooms, in factories, and in the hum of equipment calibrated by steady female hands, the German POWs witnessed something they had never seen. A society willing to let women try, to let them learn, to let them fail, to let them succeed. That was the shock that broke them open. It wasn't the machinery or the chemistry experiments or the steel being shaped by sparks. It was the quiet confidence of women who had grown up believing they had the right and the responsibility to understand the world. The former POWs carried that image back to a shattered Germany. Some returned to ruins. Some returned to families who could not comprehend what they had seen. Some returned to daughters who would grow up in a different nation. One rebuilt not only with concrete and ration books, but with new ideas about what a woman could become. Years later, when West German universities opened their doors to more women, when female scientists began appearing in laboratories across Europe, when daughters asked questions their mothers once feared to ask, the echoes of that moment reached forward in time. Not loudly, but steadily, because history is not changed only by battles or treaties. Sometimes it changes in a hallway, beside a chalkboard filled with equations, where a woman realizes that the world she was taught to accept is not the only world possible. And sometimes the most profound turning point of war is not what happened on the battlefield, but what someone saw in peace.